history goes back deep, that Israel's enemies want to sever and deny any connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And so the Romans really were the first one to do this. They got tired of these rebellious Jews. The land was called Judea, which kind of gives you a sense of who lived there.
A little bit, yeah.
It might as well have been called Jewland, Judea. And so they said, we're no longer going to call it Jewland. We're no longer calling it Judea. We're going to pick a new name that doesn't indicate your connection with this land. And to rub salt in the wound, they chose the name of Israel's traditional enemy, the Philistines. Biblical enemy, the Philistines. And so Philistine, Palestine, Palestina, they call it Palestine. That same idea lives on to the present day.
Hale yeah! Hale yeah!
Welcome back, everyone, to the show. I'm very honored to have my guest today. He is the author of Reclaiming Israel's History, Roots, Rights, and the Struggle for Peace. This is David Brog. David, how are you, sir? Welcome to the show.
Doing great, TJ. Thanks for having me.
I better show them the cover just so they know what to get when they're looking on Amazon. It's right here. So,
I like what they did with the cover.
Yeah, I've got, I don't like reading books with the cover on them, so I always take them off. But it is a very nice cover. They always get torn. I rip them. I don't like that. I like them to stay new.
They're my bookmarks.
Exactly.
I never invested in an actual bookmark. I just use the cover.
Yeah, so this is actually what the book looks like if you're not sure and you want to go find it in the bookstore. I got to say thank you for writing it. It's fantastic. I joked earlier that my wife is watching a segment on TV. She's like, you know what I really want? I want a summary of history. I want this historical summary of Israel, especially between the death of Christ and, say, the Ottoman Empire. I'm just not real clear on that. And I had secretly just gotten it. I'm thumbing through it going, yeah, me too. That would be really nice, wouldn't it be? This book is fantastic. So I thank you for writing. And I'm curious, what was the reason behind it?
This is very personal to me. I grew up in a Jewish home and a pro-Israel home. And I was raised to be supportive of Israel. Then I get to college. I went to Princeton. And all of a sudden, I'm told the truth about Israel, right? Both professors and students are telling me that things I never knew about Israel, how the Israelis, Jews came from Europe and kicked out Arabs and crushed their villages and built their cities on top of what had been a thriving Arab culture.
You got woke. Nice job.
Yeah. And so, guilty of being colonial power and guilty of ethnic cleansing and displacement. Well, I learned that. And I couldn't be pro-Israel anymore. And it became a crisis for me because my grandparents valued it, my parents valued it, and here I couldn't support Israel anymore. Luckily for me, I'm a geek, and I actually went into the library and read multiple volumes, enough that I figured out that everything I was being taught on campus wasn't true. It was this anti-Israel narrative that's become only more prevalent and only more popular since I was in college. And so for me, knowing the truth about Israel is critical because when you know the truth, you realize it's the opposite of what you're being taught, and it frees you. It gives you permission to be zealously pro-Israel. I look around the world today, and I see few societies that really carry out the highest of Western values, Judeo-Christian values, that really live up to these ideals. And I look at Israel in the most challenging of circumstances, the most dangerous of neighborhoods, living out these values, not perfectly, but striving to live out these values. And I admire Israel. I see Israel as a frontline ally, the only ally we have in the world that fights our shared enemies for us. Right? A lot of allies will permit us to fight our shared enemies for them and then criticize us in the process. I don't know of many allies that we have that fight our shared enemies for us. So for me, it's personal and critical to go out there with this truth and to compile the truth in a much more accessible way. And get out there with this truth to make sure that our relationship with Israel stays strong and vital, because I know how damaging the myths can be.
Did it cause any rifts or strife in your family? When you got to Thanksgiving after your first year at Princeton, did you have to kick your grandparents out to the curb? How did that go?
I tried to be a respectful kid. I don't know if that's in vogue.
What about after your senior year?
But I did have to raise to my parents, that now that they sent me off to school, I was smart enough to question their values. And I did have to raise with them some of the concerns I had with Israel. They were upset by it, but they didn't know enough to respond. Not many supporters of Israel, let alone apathetic people, let alone enemies of Israel, know these facts. I think a lot of people think they do. But not many people know these facts, and not many people are geeky enough to go, pull multiple volumes from the library. And that's why I tried to get the crux of it here in about 200 pages. So it's easier. I know people don't always read books today, but I wanted to make it easier for people to know this truth, because when you know the truth, you realize not only are the anti-Israel myths wrong, they have it exactly the opposite.
I say all the time on the show that we all know that the truth shall set you free, but we don't realize the implication of that is that lies make you a slave.
And remember, it's knowledge of the truth that sets you free.
Thank
we
you.
have to invest in knowing the truth. I don't know if enough people do that.
Well, in case anyone's questioning your chops because you're coming out with all this radical pro-Israel talk, which of course is not in vogue in our society, just want to go through your bio a little bit. You graduated from Princeton University, the alma mater of my ideological hero, Woodrow Wilson. So that's nice. Then you went to Harvard Law School. You're the executive director of Maccabee Task Force and the founding executive director of Christians United for Israel. You also worked as an executive at America Online. Nice. And practiced corporate law in both Israel and the United States. So basically, you've accomplished twice as more than I will in 2 lifetimes. So congratulations for that. Thanks for being an inspiration.
It's not looking that way, TJ. I looked, checked you out before I got on this, but thank you very much.
So I think it's a couple things that stood out immediately when I read the book is I expected you to be Jewish, but you're not. You're a Christian, and you were the executive director of Christians United for Israel. And as I read the book, one of the first contradictions I saw is that one of the things that I learned is how harshly the Christians treated the Jews, and so much that the Jews actually teamed up with the Muslims on several occasions to try to restore their status in Jerusalem and secure their freedom. It wasn't just the Christians, but also the Romans, the Byzantines. And some of those contradictions really struck me as odd. And I think about our understanding of covenants today in terms of, I don't want to get too wonkish into that, but in terms of the Christian responsibility to protect the covenant people of God, and how that knowledge you referred to earlier is critical for us to not just support Israel, but understand their standing in God's eyes. So I didn't mean to get on that tangent, but I want to talk about the early history in the book. Talk about the Jews losing control of Jerusalem and the contradictions in terms of how they were treated by various groups.
Well, so first of all, I just want to correct something. I am Jewish. And I think it's confusing to people.
It is. I was confused. Tell me more.
Yeah, I think it's confusing to people that a Jewish person is the executive director of Christians United for Israel. It's an interesting story. Because I was raised Jewish, when I worked for Senator Specter in Pennsylvania, I was, like a lot of Jews back then, I was surprised to meet Christians. And central Pennsylvania is a very Christian area in the Northeast. I was surprised to meet Christians who expressed such love and support for the Jewish people. And I had, I think, what's a typical Jewish reaction to that. I was skeptical, because we study the Crusades and the Inquisition, and we don't know enough about Christians to realize the vast differences between evangelicals in America today and some of what the inquisitors back in Spain centuries ago. But I got to know a lot of these folks. I got to love them. I got to be embarrassed that I had judged people I knew nothing about. And I wrote a book, my first book, called Standing with Israel, about why Christians support Israel. Through that book, I met one of the leading Christian supporters in America today, Christian supporters of Israel, Pastor John Hale YEAH out of San Antonio. And he invited me, he had this idea of creating a massive Christian pro-Israel organization in America. And he invited me onto the staff. And I remember saying to him, how will people react to having a Jewish person as executive director? And his response was, and maybe this would resonate with you, if they have a problem with a Jewish person as executive director, then they're not our kind of Christian. In other words, he saw what I didn't see, that this movement would be a movement of philo-Semitic Christians who wouldn't have a problem with the Jewish person and would, in fact, maybe even have some love and appreciation. So that's how I got that interesting credential. Now to your question.
Interesting.
Basically, there's a number of myths I try to address in this book. Myth number one is a myth common among supporters of Israel, not just opponents of Israel. And that is the myth of the 2,000-year separation. And the idea is when the Romans defeated the Jewish rebellion in 70 AD, they destroyed the temple, they destroyed Jerusalem. And the popular view is that they expelled all the Jews, put them into exile, those they didn't kill. And that thus began a 2,000-year period when Jews lived everywhere in the world except for the land of Israel. They didn't return to the land of Israel to the birth of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Kind of romantic, I guess, a people and a land separated for 2,000 years, finally reunited.
Yeah, it's the Nicholas Sparks version, right? Happy ending. I love it.
Right. It's just not true. Yeah, the Romans did destroy the temple in 70 AD, and yeah, they did massacre hundreds of thousands of Jews, exile hundreds of thousands more. But the Jewish people remained in their land. They remained a majority in their land until probably the late 5th century. The late 10th century, Muslim historians note that a majority of the people in the land of Israel, what we in the West would call Palestine, were Jews and Christians. This is 3 centuries after the Muslim conquest of this land. End of the 10th century, a majority are still Jews and Christians. And we see another thing I'll just note, and that is every time the rulers of the land of Israel or Palestine actually let Jews return and let them live decent lives, they flocked back. And we talk about Israel today as the startup nation. Israelis have developed high tech in the middle of the desert and made Israel a more prosperous country. You find numerous examples throughout history. I'll give just one. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman ruler, who was an enlightened ruler, he looked at Palestine. He said, gee, no one lives there. If I want to develop the economy there, I better get more people in. Who are the one people who are dying to move to this country? The Jews.
The Jews.
He let Jews come back. And from the 1520s to the 1560s, they developed northern Israel, the Galilee, into the textile center of the region. They imported wool and villages, Jewish villages cropped up to have raise sheep and produce local wool. They had 3,000 looms running. They had contracts in Damascus, Constantinople, Istanbul. They actually had the contract to supply the Ottoman army with their uniforms. And so Jews flocked in, developed this booming textile industry. They made Israel a startup nation back in the 16th century. And so what you see is there was no 2,000-year separation. Jews always lived there, and every time they had an opportunity, they came back, which shows you that when we say the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, that's not a claim that was somehow abandoned after Rome destroyed Jerusalem. That was a claim that was maintained to the present day.
You made a really great I don't know if it's contrast or if you basically laid out the case that there are many, many people who've had refugee status in many ways that far exceed the bad things that have happened to the Palestinians, and they get much less attention. And I thought that was a very powerful line in the book. 2 that I want to point out are the Germans and I might be saying this wrong, the Arabistanis. Is that right?
Arabistanis.
Arabistanis. Would you kind of enlighten us on exactly why those comparisons are important? So
2 things. I'm just going to close out my email here.
Sure.
First of all, after World War II, we talk about the Palestinian refugees from the 1947-48 war, a war, by the way, that the Palestinians started. It's an odd thing, You don't see a lot of Japanese protesting today about what America did in Hiroshima. You don't see a lot of Germans protesting today about what the Americans did in Dresden. There was a sense that we started this war, and perhaps we therefore, if we suffered in the war we started, I guess that we can't complain. Only in this case, the Palestinians start the war and then complain bitterly about the fact that the Israelis dared to fight back and survive. And of course, in war, things happen. Refugees are produced. But that's the case. That didn't happen anywhere else. In the millions and millions of refugees produced by World War II in its immediate aftermath, the same period, not a peep. And so the example of the German refugees is really compelling. There were anywhere from 12 to 15 million ethnic Germans expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and elsewhere immediately after World War II, after having been invaded by Nazi Germany. And many of these ethnic Germans, not all of them, many of them siding with the invading Nazis, these European countries said, enough, we want you out of here. You can look back and say that was not the right thing to do, but it was done. What's interesting is all of these ethnic Germans went into a truncated Germany, and they were absorbed. They were welcomed, they were absorbed. And more than that, the refugees themselves refused to blame those who had expelled them. They understood this was a war that Germany started. There was a lot of suffering in this war, and this was somehow a byproduct. And so instead of looking back in anger, instead of holding keys to the homes that had been German for centuries in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, they looked forward. They took Marshall Plan aid and turned Germany into the economic powerhouse of Europe. We see this repeated time and time again. 7 million Hindus expelled from Pakistan into India after the creation of Pakistan and India in 1947. 7 million Muslims out of India into Pakistan in 1947. They don't look back in anger. They built new lives. There were 700,000 Palestinian refugees after Israel's War of Independence. There were 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries after the same war. My father-in-law, I married an Israeli, my father-in-law comes from Tripoli, Libya. His family had apartment buildings and stores and land in Tripoli. They lived in poverty in Israel. You never once hear them talk about, we want our land back in Tripoli. We want our home back in Tripoli. They came, they looked forward, they built lives, they built love. There's just this one refugee population that insists not looking forward, insists on not beginning new lives, insists on going back and reclaiming what they had before the war. And I think people think because the Palestinians are the only ones bitterly complaining about the refugee status, that they must be the only refugees. They were a small percentage of the refugees that were produced in the aftermath of World War II. They're just the only ones still looking backwards.
Yeah, and I think the Arabistanis hit home as well, because it kind of reminds me of the Black Lives Matter narrative, where you're willing to attack those that you feel like are hostile to you, but you're also willing to ignore the hostilities going on within your own community. So talk about the Arabistanis a little bit.
So, people often claim that the Palestinians are uniquely troubled people because they're stateless. They're the only stateless people in the world, and therefore we have to do something to remedy their statelessness. Actually not. The Encyclopedia of Stateless Nations, there is such a thing, lists 350 stateless peoples around the world. In other words, people who are being occupied, who would like to have their own independent country, but are being forced to live under someone else's rule. And the author of the encyclopedia, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Stateless Nations, points out these 350 represent a small percentage of the actual number of stateless nations in the world, just the ones who are actively seeking their independence. So one of these stateless nations are the Arabistanis. Arabistan is a province of Iran that has traditionally been an independent emirate of Arabistan. The majority of its population are not Persians like the rest of Iran. They are Arabs. And unlike the Palestinians, which is a relatively new identity, the Arabistanis have seen themselves as a separate people and a separate entity for centuries. The Arabistanis tried to get their independence under the Shah, brutally repressed, under Khomeini, brutally repressed. I don't think things are going to go well for them because most of Iran's oil is in Arabistan. And Iran without Arabistan is an Iran without oil. There are about 6 million of them. So, when you see people complaining about the Palestinian Arabs who don't have a state of their own, you have to ask the question, why is it they don't ever talk about the even larger population of Arabistani Arabs who don't have a state of their own and who live under a brutal, repressive Iranian regime? And it brings you to this double standard. And look, a double standard's never an excuse. If Israel behaves poorly, then Israel should be held to account. But you do have to wonder, with the hundreds of stateless peoples around the globe, and with so many examples of stateless Arabs, why it is that people only seem to really protest and really dig in and create a movement to boycott only one country that is blamed for the statelessness of a people. And of course, the great irony is this one country that's blamed for the statelessness of a people, Israel, has offered that people their own country multiple times. Israel has offered the Palestinians a state of their own on multiple occasions. The Palestinians have turned it down. Iran's never offered the Arabistanis a state of their own. So again, you wonder, why is this one country singled out for this criticism?
I want to talk about that in more detail. I definitely want you to tell us, who is Albert Moi? You talk about him in your book in the beginning, and I think he's a very inspirational figure. There's a lot we can learn from him. Why is he important?
It's a very good question. Albert Moi is a fascinating guy. During the 1950s, there were a wave of independence movements in Africa and Asia. A lot of Arab countries had been under European colonial rule, and after World War II, they started seeking their own independence. So Memi was a Tunisian, and Memi was involved in the movement to win Tunisia's independence from France. And through the work of he was part of the independence party called Dastur. Through Memi's work and his colleagues' work, Tunisia won its independence from France. But Memi was unlike most of the Arab independence fighters in Northern Africa and in Asia. Memi was Jewish. And Memi eventually fled the very country he helped liberate, Tunisia, because of the anti-Semitism he faced there. And Memi's very clear. He says this idea that Jews lived as full equals in the Arab world for so many centuries really wasn't true. Jews were almost always a second-class status. If you know much about Islam, you know the concept of the dhimmi. They tolerated Christians and Jews, but there were a series of laws that required them to have a second-class status and to be always reminded of their second-class status. And those laws were observed strictly more often than they were not. And so Memi said something very interesting, which is, you know, if the colonized people of North Africa suffered, you know, Frantz Fanon wrote a famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, describing the suffering of the colonized people of Africa. He said if the Arabs of Africa were the wretched of the earth and suffered, and they were, and he fought for their independence, then the Jews of the Arab world were even worse than the wretched of the earth. They were colonized by the colonized. They were the second-class citizens of the colonized. And then he said something very interesting, which is, why in this vast land, this vast Arab world stretching from Morocco to Iraq, why is it only Muslims get to have independence? Why don't we Jews deserve independence as well on even a small sliver of this land we've shared? The Jewish communities of North Africa predated the Muslim conquest. They're older than the Muslim communities of the Arab countries of North Africa. Why don't we get even some independence on a tiny sliver of the common Middle East that we share? And it brings up a critical point that most people don't realize. Most Israelis today do not trace their roots to Europe. You know, when people complain that the Jews should go back to Poland or Germany, they're missing the fact that most of Israelis don't come from Poland and Germany. The majority of Israelis trace their roots back to the Arab and Muslim Middle East, from Morocco through to Iran, Persian Iran. And they lived under great persecution. And what you see in Israel is really the persecuted, the colonized of the colonized, saying we too deserve freedom and independence.
I want to go back to my original question now that you brought that up, because I didn't ask it very well, but what struck me as odd is when there was a revolution or a takeover or some kind of war mounted in the area around Jerusalem, it was the Jews who, out of desperation to get back to their homeland, would allow the invaders through the wall. I mean, I think the first example you gave was when the Persians first showed up. Maybe it was the Byzantines. I forget who it was. You can tell me. The Jews essentially would say, look, there's a giant wall. We can show you how to get in.
Right.
We can let you through the back door, and you can basically be the Trojan horse. And that happened on more than one occasion.
No, that's exactly right. So we're getting back to the fact that the Jews never left.
Right.
And so when invaders came, you know, just like when Ottoman Sultan Suleiman said, gee, how do I develop Palestine? There's only one people that really wants to come move here. I'll let the Jews back in. Throughout the centuries, when invaders came to conquer the land, they knew there was one people who knew the land well and could help them. So in 614, the year 614, the Persians invaded Palestine. It was ruled by the Byzantines at the time.
That's right.
And there was still such a large Jewish community. Remember, you know, like I said before, even into the late 10th century, a majority of the people in Palestine were Christians and Jews. There was such a large Jewish population that the Persians said, okay, the Christians are going to side with the Byzantines, the Christian Byzantine Empire. Maybe we can get the Jews to side with us. And they invaded from the north and met with the Jewish leaders of the Galilee. And the Jewish leaders so suffered under the Byzantines, they said, yeah, you got it. We'll help you. They raised a fighting force of between 20 to 25,000 Jewish soldiers from the Galilee. And together, you know, you almost long for these days of Persian-Jewish solidarity.
Yeah, that's the part that strikes me as odd.
Yeah. Together, Persians and Jews marched on and conquered Jerusalem. They knew that if they wanted to defeat the Byzantines, they needed Jewish help. They got it. They won. And then once the Persians conquered Jerusalem, they let the Jews return to their capital. The Byzantines had not permitted Jews to live there. Unfortunately, that was short-lived. Unfortunately, the Byzantines got it back. They sort of took their revenge on the Jews. But that second Byzantine persecution didn't last very long, because in 636, a new invader came. And that was the Arabs coming up from the south. And when the Arabs invaded, it was the same story. They said, who can help us defeat the Christians ruling in Palestine? Who knows this land well? The Jews. And so it was actually the Jews who helped the Arabs conquer both their historical accounts of how the Jews helped the Arabs conquer both Hebron, and Caesarea. Two very big cities. In each case, Jews came out, and because of their knowledge of the cities, could show the Arab invaders an easy way to get through the fortifications. Again, you long for those days of Jewish-Arab solidarity.
That was my question too. As time goes on, there are the Christian crusaders who come in. Again, you said that the Jews primarily fight against the Christians with the Muslims. And then even later, when Napoleon Bonaparte asked for their help, they said no. And I thought it's really a case for them of which alliance is going to help us preserve our posterity in Jerusalem. Whereas I, living today as a naive, Christian, looking at the covenants, I think back then there was a struggle for power that overcame the struggle for truth and doctrinal wisdom, which is that the Jews, I believe the Jews and the Christians' future are intertwined. And I find it odd that they were siding with Persians who now want to wipe them off the face of the earth against even, I don't know what Napoleon Bonaparte claimed to be, but they said no to many other people who wanted help giving them Jerusalem, ostensibly. Was it just because they were scared it had been taken away from them so many times? So many broken promises?
So first of all, I got to say something here, DJ. You actually read the book. You do a lot of these interviews, and you can tell people have not read the book. So if I had a hat on, it would be off. Appreciate that. B, it's a deep wound in the Christian community, and we mentioned I work very closely with the pro-Israel Christian community, that not all Christians throughout history have sort of viewed the Jewish people as God's chosen and as a people that should be respected or honored. There were episodes in the Christian history where Christians, usually not theological leaders, usually secular Christians, attacked Jews and did not much like Jews. So, when the Crusaders were coming to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule, and the Muslim rulers had treated Christians poorly and destroyed Christian churches. On their way to the Middle East to fight the Muslim infidel, there were crusaders who decided to get an early start fighting infidels, and they slaughtered Jews along the way.
Scorched earth, right?
Yeah, no, I've actually written about this because as a Jew, I was always brought up knowing that this was something that the Catholic Church did to us and Christians did to us. In my second book, In Defense of Faith, I actually write about this. It turns out these were some crusader bands, but not acting on orders of the church. And in fact, when the Catholic Church found out about this, they actually ordered the massacres of Jews to be stopped. Tragically, it was too late. But these were rogue bands of crusaders, not under any Catholic authority, who did these things. It was human evil more than Christian evil, I would say.
Right,
but
well said.
But still, when they got to the Middle East, the Jews living there were afraid of this invader and afraid they would not do well under this invader's rule. They had had bad experiences under the Byzantine Christian rule, and I think those memories were still fresh. Things weren't so bad yet with the Arabs. And so they decided they would stand and fight alongside Muslims against this invader that they did not have good memories or good recent history with. By the way, I would note this, Crusader accounts. And in those days, people did not like writing nice things about Jews. Crusader accounts say that a majority of the defenders of Haifa were Jewish, and that they defended the city far longer than they predicted they could. And they were braver fighters than they ever predicted they would be, and that a large percentage and among the best fighters defending Jerusalem were Jews. So again, it's just another point that Jews were there. They never left. And no matter which side, they were there fighting for what they thought would provide them with a possibility to live in peace and live their lives.
As an aside, going back to what I brought up, when you talk about the Jews flourishing like a rose in this desert wasteland for the 40 or so years they were there, you talk about them encountering resistance and saying the Jews, fought like lions, like the stories in the Old Testament. Again, that's what bothers me. Even today, when I talk to people in the alt-right, the first tinge of anti-Semitism, like you don't understand the covenant people. You don't understand the promises made to covenant people. That means they will be the most blessed and sometimes most persecuted people on earth. That goes for anyone who's under the covenant. My personal opinion, but that frustrates me to no end when they hate Jews for the sake of hating Jews. They don't understand.
What I've come to believe, again, I mentioned my history. I, like a lot of Jews, was suspicious of Christians bearing gifts or giving hugs. What I've come to learn is that because of what we shared, come on in, brother, hug it out. What I've come to learn is that Christians who take their faith seriously are the best friends the Jewish people have in the world today, and friends we dearly need in the world today, because Lord knows we have some determined enemies, enemies who, by the way, don't much like either one of us. And through that, I took a look not only at the present day in America and really the beautiful community of Christian support for Israel that exists, but looking back in the past and realizing that even the anti-Semitism of the past that we're raised learning about was not as Christian as people believe or as we were taught. The Crusades we discussed, the Spanish Inquisition, secular powers in Spain, the king and queen pushed for that. The church finally gave in. They tried to control it. They tried to limit it. I mean, it's not a great episode in the history of the church by any stretch. But you look at it, and it's not, you always envision the church going after the Jews. The reality is more complex. You have secular people going after the Jews and the church trying to restrain and manage. So I think what you say is very true. And I always say this to people, that alt-right you're afraid of, that anti-Semitic alt-right, I bet you none of them are really serious believing Christians. I bet you they are secular people because it doesn't match. It doesn't work together, being a believing Christian and an anti-Semite.
We're running a little short on time here. Let's talk about the end of your book when you talk about the most noble army in the world. And let's go back to your reference to the many times the Jewish community has offered Palestine, which, by the way, you mentioned, I didn't know this, Palestine was created by the Romans to basically sever, to kind of bring on their ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people. They were unsuccessful in wars. They said, you know what, let's start changing the language, which is what we see today in the culture war. So talk about Palestine as it is and was, and talk about how many opportunities the Jews have made with an olive branch to try to make peace.
Yeah, well, it's the history. What you point out is very interesting. This history goes back deep. That Israel's enemies want to sever and deny any connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and so the Romans really were the first one to do this. They got tired of these rebellious Jews. And so they said, we're not only going to murder you, we're not only going to exile you, but we're going to insult you by taking away the name of the land that indicates it's your land. The land was called Judea, which kind of gives you a sense of who lived there.
A little bit, yeah.
It might as well have been called Jewland, Judea. And so they said, we're no longer going to call it Jewland. We're no longer calling it Judea. We're going to pick a new name that doesn't indicate your connection with this land. And to rub salt in the wound, they chose the name of Israel's traditional enemy, the Philistines. Biblical enemy, the Philistines. And so Philistine, Palestine, Palestina, they call it Palestine. That same idea lives on to the present day, denying the Jewish connection to the land as a way of trying to prevent a Jewish presence in the land. Just one example. When Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, was with Prime Minister Ehud Barak of Israel at Camp David under Bill Clinton trying to negotiate a peace deal. Barak offered him a Palestinian state in 94% of the West Bank, Arab East Jerusalem, all of Gaza with land swaps from Israel. Arafat turned it down, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But Arafat is sitting with Clinton. Clinton, by the way, got angry at Arafat. He said, we've been here 14 days, and Arafat has said no to every single offer made to him. He didn't mince his words about who was to blame for the lack of a peace deal. He blamed Arafat. So Arafat turns to Clinton.
Here. We got things to do. All right, I see one there. I see one there. Come on, Yasser, let's wrap this up. Get back to the palace.
Nice. So Arafat turns to Clinton and says, there never was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. It's an interesting thing to say. I mean, Clinton is a Christian. Interesting thing to say to a Christian person. Well, I won't get into that. Believes himself, comes out of a Christian church. So interesting thing to say, right? If there was no Jewish temple, where exactly did Jesus teach and pray? What's fascinating is Arafat didn't even realize it would be a bad idea to deny to Clinton that there was ever a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That's how internalized it is. They have to insist Jews never were in the land of Israel. It's the only way they can maintain their position that Jews have no rights to be in that land, and therefore there should be no compromise with Jews in that land. That's how deep it goes. So from Roman times until yesterday, the denial of a Jewish connection to the land. Now, while it's a new thing, because of the British mandate for Palestine, no one ever called this land Palestine except for Christian travelers during the Middle Ages. When Britain conquered the land from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and they got a mandate from the League of Nations to rule it, they called it the British Mandate for Palestine. They took that term that had been popular in the West, never used by the Arabs, never used by the Jews. Because of these new borders and because of the name Palestine, the Arabs living there in this new area eventually began to see themselves as a new Arab people called the Palestinians. It took a while. We have to remember this. At first, they just saw themselves as Ottoman subjects. Then they identified with the geographic region of Syria. The Arabs never saw Palestine as a geographic region, so they saw themselves as Southern Syrians. Then they saw themselves as Arabs. There was a pan-Arab nationalist movement that said we're all one Arab people from Morocco to Iraq. They saw themselves as Arabs. Then they saw themselves as Jordanians when Jordan conquered the West Bank in 1948. Finally, they began to see themselves as a new Arab people called the Palestinians. So you have this 3,000-year-old Jewish people with this 3,000-year-old bond and claim to the land, and you have this new people. But people don't know this. It wasn't until 1974 that the Arab League recognized such a thing as the Palestinian people. It wasn't until 1974 that the United Nations recognized such a thing as a Palestinian Arab people. So the 3,000-year-old Jewish people sees this new people claiming that they exist and seeking independence. And what do the Jews do? They say, okay, sure. We'll negotiate with you. We'll split the land with you. And so as the Palestinians are developing this national consciousness, the Jews of Palestine, later the Israelis, offered the Arabs of Palestine, later the Palestinians, their own state on 5 separate occasions: 1937, 1947, 1967, 2000, and 2008. 5 times they offered them a state of their own. We'll see. You want the land, we want the land, let's split it. 5 times. Israelis offer it, Palestinians say no. And they often say no quite violently. They said no in 1948 quite violently by attacking and trying to destroy the Jewish state. They said no after Arafat went home from Camp David. He started competing with Hamas to see who could blow up more Israelis in what became known as the Second Intifada. I mean, this is what Israel gets for offering peace. So this is a critical thing. You meet students across the country who are upset that the Palestinians don't have a state and that there's not peace in the Middle East. Fair enough. Okay. What I can't understand is why do you automatically blame Israel for it? If you know a little bit about the history, which most people don't, you realize that one side's repeatedly offered, the other side's repeatedly said no. Maybe the blame should be placed on those who have said no. People like to say that conflicts are complex. They're gray. There's no black and white. There's gray. Well, it's a very black and white statement that there's no black and white. Sure, every conflict's a little gray. Israel's not perfect. But when you look at the history, patterns sometimes can be discerned. And in this conflict, there is a clear pattern that can be discerned of one side willing to split the land and compromise, the other side not willing to do it. They don't want to live side by side with the Jewish state. They want to destroy and rule the land that's now under the control of the Jewish state.
You said it earlier, so I didn't have to. It is an easy read. It's 200 pages. You can read it in a day. And for a long time, this will be the first book that I recommend to people who want a fair-minded breakdown of Israel's history. Because you do take shots at Jewish people as well and say, look, there are times when they deserve criticism. No country should be above criticism. But we have to examine those patterns that have emerged and have an honest conversation about how we got to this point. So I thank you for that. Is there anything else very important that someone's going to get out of this book who reads it for the first time, who's open-minded enough to pick it up and read it from cover to cover?
Well, I think there's a series of myths that I try to bust. And what you said, I just want to repeat. Israel is a country of men, right? It's a country of men. It's fallible. They make mistakes. Israeli soldiers, like any other soldier, sometimes they get nervous in war, angry in war, and do the wrong thing. So This is not the book of how Israel is perfect. What this is a book about is Israel's not the demon, not the devil. In fact, when you look at the decisions Israeli leaders made under very difficult circumstances, more often than not, you're going to find yourself saying, wow, I would have done the same thing, and I might have done it sooner and harder and quicker. There's a lot of myths I try to bust. So the myth of the 2,000-year separation, I try to address. The myth that Israel should be blamed for the lack of a Palestinian state, I address that head on. Lots of other myths. For example, when we discussed this briefly earlier, there's this idea in the minds of many that Palestine is a country that can only hold so many people, right? It's a zero-sum game. Only so many houses, I guess. So every Jew that returned to Israel in this most modern wave of Jewish return, the modern Zionist movement, must have displaced an Arab, right? So it's great that Jews wanted to come home, but in the process, they expelled Arabs. I just want to read to you some British statistics, right? The British ruled Palestine from I'm putting the glasses on now, TJ. The British ruled Palestine from 1920 until 1947. During this period, they let Jews return to their land. So you have the highest years, the years of the most Jewish immigration to Palestine were from 1920 to 1937. During these years of peak Jewish immigration, I want to see how much did the Arab population go down? How many Arabs were displaced? Oh, wait a second. You look, these are British statistics. The Arab population didn't increase. The Arab population during these years of peak Jewish immigration rose from approximately 600,000 to 950,000. That's a growth rate of over 50% in 17 years, a statistic that Britain's Peel Commission called remarkable. So it's the opposite of what people say. Jewish immigration to Palestine didn't displace Arabs. The opposite happened. It created economic opportunities that caused both Arab immigration to Palestine from neighboring Arab countries and Arab in-migration from the Arab areas of Palestine to those areas being settled by Jews. And the Brits break it down by city. The cities to which no Jews were moving, Arab population grew a little. Cities to which Jews were moving, Arab population grew dramatically. So that's just another myth we have to get out of the way. Then comes the myth of the Palestinian refugees, that Israel began the War of Independence in 1947 and ethnically cleansed their country to get the Arabs out. Truth, of course, is Israel desperately tried to avoid the 1947 war. It did not want that war. It did not think it would survive that war. You had a tiny army without enough guns. Each soldier got rationed a bullet. It's like Barney Fife in the Andy Griffith Show. Each soldier was rationed a bullet. And they were being invaded by armies with tanks and planes, and they were outnumbered. Israel tried to avoid the war. Ultimately, the Palestinian Arabs started it. Their Arab neighbors joined in it. In the course of this desperate struggle for survival, there were Palestinian refugees, both because they fled, and in some cases, Israel took strategic villages and expelled Arabs. Here's the thing to remember. There was not one Palestinian refugee. Not one Palestinian refugee until this war of aggression that the Palestinians themselves started. So we're back where we began, which is, it's odd to me the way with such indignation Palestinians complain about their suffering under their own aggression.
Was it your book where I read this, or was it another one where we talk about the calls for freedom and liberation with the absence of any call for accountability, because the two cannot be separated?
Well, I didn't write that, but I wish I had, because I like that.
But in the absence of any accountability, freedom and peace will never be accomplished. I think you did say that. Until we're willing to take responsibility for, I swear, you wrote a lot of great stuff. It had to be in there somewhere.
I like it. Okay. I'll go with it.
You cannot establish a free nation under the foundation of deceit, lies, and non-accountability. You can't do it.
No. And just the last thought I wanted to share. We've seen lately the latest round of violence against Israelis has been what's being called the stabbing intifada. You're seeing young men, sometimes women, sometimes not such young men, but it's largely young men, literally going into their mother's kitchens, grabbing the longest knife they can find and going out into the streets to murder Israelis. And you wonder what drives a young man to go out and do that. And I got to think they do that because they're taught that there never was a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. There never was a Jewish temple. There never was a Jewish presence. That the Israelis they're living next to are simply Europeans who have come and stolen their land and crushed their society. If you believe those facts, then compromise with Israel isn't courageous or virtuous. It's cowardice.
Right.
And so I think this myth, this anti-Israel narrative, not only does damage on American campuses, I think it does damage right in the heartland of Israel, driving Palestinians to want to murder these disgusting conquerors, colonizers. And so I think it's so critical. I am very passionate about getting the truth about Israel out there, because my belief is if a Palestinian one day would be raised, like Israelis are raised to say, we Jews have a connection here, we Jews have rights here, but when we came back, there were Arabs living here, and they too have rights here. That's why so many Jews have supported a compromise. The day Arabs are raised and not taught lies about Jews, but are taught that, yes, Jews have a connection here, Jews have rights here, both of us need to find a way to live together, that's when we'll start being optimistic about peace. Right now, that's not happening. And because it's not happening, we're seeing the stabbing intifada. Yeah, just the latest wave of violence.
Well, it was Prager who said that it's the virtuous and noble society that doesn't speak of destroying their enemies because they can't, but could wipe them out tomorrow if they wanted to, right? Isn't that Israel's position? If they wanted the Arab nation gone tomorrow, they could do it.
Well, and that's what's so ridiculous. And you mentioned I have a chapter in the book called The Most Moral Army in the World. When you see the way Israel handles itself in its recent conflicts in Gaza, and you see people claiming about genocide and destruction, if Israel really wanted to, it could wipe out Gaza. It has the firepower. But Israel's power is married to its Judeo-Christian values. So Israel struggles valiantly to separate the wicked from the innocent, to target the terrorists while sparing the civilians around them. And civilians are surrounding them, of course, because Hamas, on purpose, stores its missiles in civilian areas and fires its missiles from civilian areas. They want to give the Israelis a dilemma. If you want to stop the missiles from landing in your city, and of course they target Israeli civilian areas. It gives Israel a dilemma. If you want to stop these missiles from raining down on your cities, you've got to come take out the missiles. In the process, you might hurt civilians, and you better believe we're going to take those harmed civilians and put them on the internet and try to use that to show what an ugly power you are. If I have time just to go through very quickly the steps Israel takes to protect innocent civilian lives, it's stunning. Before they will go into any neighborhood in Gaza, this is the past 3 wars in Gaza, Israel left Gaza in 2005, said to the Arabs, please, it's yours, develop it, develop your economy, it will create a virtuous cycle to peace. Instead of getting the virtuous cycle to peace, more missiles are fired into Israel from Gaza after Israel left than before they left. It was turned into a Hamas terrorist base. Israel's had to go back 3 times to try to stop the thousands of missiles from being fired from Gaza onto its cities. Before they go into any neighborhood to stop the missile fire, they blanket the neighborhood in leaflets saying, we're coming. It might get dangerous, but if you use these following routes during the following hours, you can leave safely. Those who do are unharmed. They survive. They're safe. Then as it narrows its approach from a neighborhood to a building, it calls or texts every inhabitant of that building to say, we're coming to take out a certain apartment in this building that has been the source of missile fire, or we know that missiles are stored there. Please leave. It's not going to be safe for you. They call and text. Learning that Israelis will not harm a building if they see civilians are still in it, civilians have taken to going onto the roof of that building after they get the text or the call that Israel's coming. Sometimes they do it at gunpoint. Hamas forces them up. So Israel's developed a third technique called knocking on the roof. They developed an inert bomb that makes a loud noise. They drop it on the roof. No one's hurt. It makes a very loud, frightening noise. Then they count. We saw 8 people on the roof. We just saw the 8th person leave. Now we can strike the building. But you know what's interesting in taking all of these steps to make sure that no innocent civilians are harmed? Not only the innocent civilians know Israel's coming, Hamas knows too. So the very missiles they want to take out and the very terrorists they want to take out are often taken out before Israel can get there, which means Israel's putting its own civilians at risk and its own citizens at risk by enabling Hamas to leave with missiles that will definitely be fired on Israel from some other place at some other time. They do that because they don't want to be an army that harms civilians. Israel is a citizen army. Every Israeli male and every Israeli female has to serve in that army. They don't want to live with the burden of having harmed civilians. They don't want that kind of army. They will not serve in that kind of army. So Israel puts its own citizens in danger in the effort, again, to strike the guilty while sparing the innocent. I admire it. And when I write Israel's the most moral army in the world, I'm not exaggerating. Richard Kemp Colonel Richard Kemp from Britain, who was in charge of Britain's army in Afghanistan. He knows a thing or two about counterterrorism. He observed 2 of Israel's operations in Gaza, and he said the following: no army in the history of warfare has done more to protect innocent civilians in the combat zone than Israel has done in Gaza. From everything I've seen and read, he's absolutely right. And yet Israel's portrayed as the heartless aggressor.
That's interesting. I interviewed Nani Darwish recently, whose father was killed by the Israeli army. He was an Egyptian intelligence officer. And she says that for 30 years, she blamed Israelis until she was enlightened. And now she blames the Muslim culture for, I think it was her sheikh who came in when she was 11 years old and said, how many Jews are you going to kill to avenge your father? And I would suggest that's the reason, like you said, that these people go in and grab knives and stab whoever's closest to them.
That exists. I think Americans have a hard time believing that. When we talk about that, I think they think we must be exaggerating, because come on, TJ, everyone's the same, right? Yeah. Everyone wants the same things. No, there are evil ideologies out there. Nazism was an evil ideology. I don't think it was a virtuous, just another good idea. It was an evil ideology that led people to do evil things. And radical Islam, I'm sorry, it's an evil ideology. Any ideology that says it's okay to kill non-Muslims for the sake of your faith, for the sake of your politics, innocent civilians, that to me crosses a line that should never be crossed. It's evil, and those who believe it, those who practice it, are perpetrating evil. And it's time, I think, a lot of our young Americans woke up to the fact that the whole world isn't like what we have here in America, which is such a rare human achievement. They also need to wake up to the fact that the values that make America such a rare human achievement are not out there in the ether, not out there in the atmosphere. They're actually Judeo-Christian values. Most of them don't realize that either.
Well, David, you did not disappoint. I can't recommend this book strongly enough. If the sound of David's voice wants to make you stab someone, please put the knife down in your mom's basement, in her kitchen, and go out and read this book. It's going to get you started on opening your mind. And we didn't get to get into how leftism has a soft spot for Muslim terrorism, but I did hear David Horowitz say the other day on Dave Rubin's show that Nazism was the only good war for the left. And that's because we were fighting white people. Interesting thought I hadn't heard of before, but every other war against any other people, there's no reason for it.
There's a lot of truth there. And, I think a lot of the reason why the left hates Israel is the left has this rigid paradigm. The evil in the world, the damage in the world has been done by white Europeans and Americans. The third world people of color, indigenous peoples are virtuous. So in this conflict between Israel and her neighbors, the white Israelis are the evil, and the darker Arabs are not. And of course, that misunderstands so many things. The fact that the Jews are indigenous to Judea, to Israel, and the fact that even a more current connection, that the large majority of Israelis are not from Europe. They're actually the colonized of the colonized, the oppressed and the wretched of the Arab and Muslim world. That's Israel. But they've made a very nice state for themselves and for the 20% of Israelis who are Arabs.
Well, if you're listening to this, read the book. Also search for David Brog online. Look for him on YouTube, on websites, and gobble up any other content you can get from him. And we'll look forward to whatever your next project is after this book has been read by as many people as possible, David. So I thank you very much.
TJ, thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Good luck out there.
Thank you.